The story begins with Danby, a high school senior in her final year. She's just days away from taking her university entrance exams, but the problem is she's horrible at math. She always falls asleep during math class, which annoys her teacher so much that one day he calls her up to the board, but as always, she can't solve a single thing. Frustrated, he scolds her in front of the entire class. When she gets home, she ignores her studies and spends her time scrolling on her phone and listening to music. Her mom watches her in irritation and says that if Danby solved math problems the way she memorizes song lyrics, she'd already be a genius. She jokes that Danby must have inherited her math troubles from her father, who wasn't good at it either, and that no university would accept her if she keeps this up. But what annoys Danby the most is when her mom switches the TV to one of those historical dramas she always watches. Danby eventually gives up and leaves the room, heading over to her best friend's house. Her friend reminds her again that this is her final chance to get into college. If she fails now, she'll have no direction and nowhere to go. The next morning, Danby wakes up late and rushes out, already behind schedule for her big exam. Her mom encourages her as she leaves, telling her to try her best so she can get into a good school. Danby is anxious, especially about the math section, but she tries to cram some studying on the bus until she reaches the testing center. She jumps off the bus and runs, but forgets her umbrella. As she nears the exam building, fear takes over. She isn't ready. She starts panicking, thinking about running away instead of facing the possibility of failing. She sits under the pouring rain, heart sinking, quietly wishing she could just disappear. There's a shallow puddle in front of her, created by the rain. She steps toward it, and suddenly something strange happens. She sees a group of people dressed in unfamiliar clothing, gathered together and praying for rain. They say it hasn't rained in 3 years, and people are dying from the drought. Suddenly, Danby finds herself falling into the puddle and begins drowning. But instead of dying, she emerges in the same spot, but somehow in another world. Confused, she starts asking the people nearby if they're filming some kind of historical drama. The king, seeing her bizarre behavior, becomes terrified and shouts, asking if she's a demon. She nervously says, "No, I'm just a high school student," but the way she says it sounds like some type of magical spell to them, which only increases their fear. Suddenly, guards surround her with their swords drawn. When she realizes the swords are real, she panics and blurts out, "Please wait, I'm just a student from the future. I ended up here by accident." She tries to convince him that she knows plenty of history, and when that doesn't work, she quickly adds that she's also incredibly good at math. Cured, the king gives her a mission: teach math to the people. If she succeeds, he'll let her return home. But he becomes her first student, and she's shocked to discover he doesn't even know how to count. She patiently teaches him from absolute basics: numbers, addition, subtraction, and eventually multiplication. Soon, they prepare for a math competition against a rival city's music scholar. If Danby loses, she'll be punished. She boldly challenges the king and even smacks him out of frustration when he gets answers wrong. The guards rush in, ready to execute her for touching the king, but he stops them and laughs it off. Whenever the queen visits, they quickly hide all the math papers and pretend they're practicing music instead. One day, the king notices Danby is starving and invites her to eat with him, but she doesn't like the royal dishes, so she takes him to the kitchen and uses ingredients from her bag to make him some delicious instant noodles. He absolutely loves them, even though they're very spicy. When she offered him water, he refused, saying he likes the heat. The next morning, the entire palace heard him screaming. When Danby checks on him, she finds he put a protective talisman on his ear. Thinking she cursed him, she rolls her eyes and says, "Relax, superstar, it was just noodles, not dark magic. There was no spell, it was simply the chili hitting his stomach too hard." When she explained that, he asked, "What's a stomach?" So she sat down and taught him about the stomach, intestines, and even the heart, and how he can feel it beating if he puts his hand on his chest. But he says he doesn't feel anything. She smiles and replies, "That's okay. One day, when you're with someone you love, you'll feel it yourself." He becomes amazed by her knowledge and starts seeing her as a genius scholar. Soon, he asks her to teach all the royal scholars of Joseon. Later, the two of them go outside and play ball in the palace courtyard, and she manages to get him to run for the first time in years. The next day, the king sits with his future bride and tells her that he will be given a magical love potion in his stew that night, and once he drinks it, they'll be married immediately. But fate had different plans. That bowl ended up in Danby's hands instead. After drinking it, she started acting very strangely and eventually fell asleep inside the palace. When she woke up, she kept apologizing to the king, but he simply told her, "Nothing happened, just go, forget it." They walked outside for some fresh air, and he told her that if she completed her mission, she would earn a high-ranking position in the royal council and even be gifted a royal horse, where she replied, "I don't want anything.
As soon as it rains, I'm going back to my world." The king looked at her and said, "Then from now on, don't treat me like a king. We're equals, man to man." But the next day, disaster hit. Dani was arrested and accused of insulting the king. They tied her by her limbs, preparing to torture her. Right before it began, the king stepped in and told the priests that this young scholar carried knowledge too valuable to waste. But one priest seized the chance and said, "Fine, then I'll test him myself. He has 2 weeks. If it doesn't rain by then, we will execute him." Dani refused to give up. She studied nonstop, calculating everything she could. The palace musician helped her build a rain gauge, hoping it would prove her predictions. Then, without warning, rain suddenly poured from the sky. Danby was overwhelmed with joy, but the king remembered her words that she would leave once it rained. Panicking, he ran to the house where she stayed and found her crying in front of the rain gauge, overwhelmed with emotion. He told her, "You need to escape right now. I've already prepared everything. A ship headed for Ming is waiting for you." But she shook her head. "All my life, I've been running. I ended up here because I was trying to escape my world." At that moment, the palace musician arrived. He had been secretly working with the high priest. The priest had ordered him to kill the scholar, fearing Dani might truly be from the future. The musician told him, if that's true, he's even more dangerous. He must be eliminated. The musician grabbed Dani, put her on a horse, and rode deep into the forest. Once they stopped, he turned to her and said, "I've known for a while that you're a girl, but I'm not a bad man. Your secret is safe." She explained that she hadn't meant to deceive anyone. The position she got was meant for a boy, and she had no choice but to take it. Back at the palace, the high priest tried convincing the king that everything Dani taught them must be erased, especially the new writing system she was developing. They should stick to tradition and remove the boy's influence. But the king refused. He left the palace on horseback, determined to find her. Meanwhile in the forest, guards finally caught up to Danby and the musician. He stayed behind to fight them off, buying her time to escape. The queen herself appeared moments later, her feet bleeding from running. She had been desperately searching for them. Danby kept walking down the path until she reached a fork in the road and didn't know where to go. Then she remembered something the king once told her, that the sun is Joseon's clock. So she followed the sunlight until she reached the sea. And there, the king was already waiting for her. That night, they sat side by side under the sky, watching the stars. She told him, "In the future, we don't see stars like this, only the brightest ones." He replied, "Look again. The stars you see now are the ones you choose to see. But if you stop and look closely, you'll notice more. Those stars were always there. They just didn't appear until you decided to see them. The eyes notice what the heart wants." After a quiet moment, the king confessed that he loved her. He said he wanted to create a new, easier writing system so common people could learn, not just nobles. She suddenly remembered something and took out the money she brought from the future and saw his face printed on the currency. That's when she realized he really would succeed. When the king returned to the palace, he announced that he would begin paying salaries to those who served the people well. Shockingly, the high priest agreed, saying that anyone who benefits the people deserves reward. What do you think of Goam? But no one else in the court agreed, insisting that Gosam should be banished or even executed. Still, Dani continued teaching the king in secret, covering everything from math to writing to reasoning, all without the priests noticing. One day, while walking through the palace, she discovered the queen hiding and quietly eating. The queen had been forbidden from eating too much so she wouldn't gain weight and ruin her appearance. Dani offered her one of her instant noodle cups. The queen accepted it, and as they ate together, they began chatting. From that moment on, they became friends. A few days later, the queen approached the king and told him that she knew everything. She had also informed the queen mother because Dani was supposed to be one of the king's concubines. Suddenly, Dani found herself being prepared for something she didn't understand. Palace maids were dressing her up and applying makeup. She had no clue what was happening until she realized they were preparing her for the king's midday rest, and she was expected to become his first woman.
The moment she understood, she panicked and ran from the frantic people surrounding her. One of the head maids quickly informed the king that she had escaped on her way to the palace. The king went out to search for her and eventually found her, but he grabbed her arm and pulled her into a room. Dani screamed, protesting, "You said we'd stay just friends. I'm only 19. The king chuckled and replied, 19? That means you have at least 3 years of adulthood. You're no longer a child. Besides, I've known you were a girl for a while now. I haven't touched you, have I? But tonight, you need to stay here. Everyone is watching. Don't worry, I'm not going to eat you alive. The truth is, my mother is extremely stubborn, and no one can persuade her easily." The next morning, Dani went to speak with the musician. He asked, "Are you sure you want to go back to the future?" But she didn't answer. She was torn, her heart full of doubt. She simply walked off and sat alone. After a while, the queen came to her and said that someone wished to see her. When Danny entered the palace, she found herself face to face with the queen mother, who looked strikingly like her own real mother. Danny broke down in tears, and no one could understand what had triggered her emotion. That night, she went to see the new astronomical system of Joseon, one she had personally helped create. It was designed to allow the kingdom to track days and months accurately. The king then invited her to see another project he had been working on. He had developed a new alphabet of 28 letters, meant to simplify reading and writing so everyone in Joseon, not just scholars, could learn. As they walked into the center of the Great Hall, he asked her to sit in the ceremonial chair. Then he placed the royal hairpin on her head, a symbol of marriage, and asked her to stay with him forever. Danny began crying and said, "I can't. I promised myself I'd return once the rain came. My mother is waiting, and she trusts me." The king gently replied, "Then go see her and come back. Let's live here together." But she refused again. Losing his patience, he said angrily, "You're right. The future is better than this Joseon, full of sickness and disease. Do whatever you want." Then he stormed off, heartbroken. Danny remained standing in the hall when suddenly she was struck on the head and knocked unconscious. Someone stabbed her with a sword, and the entire building was set on fire. When the king heard what had happened, he risked his life and ran through the flames to rescue her. The next day, he summoned his assistant and said, "The ancient text disappeared last night." He accused the high priest of stealing it. The king grabbed the priest's hand and said, "Did no one teach you to erase all evidence after committing a crime like this?" Then he turned to Danny and asked, "Was this the voice you heard?" She nodded. It turned out that the book in her bag had shielded her from the stab. The king, furious, confronted the priest. "You knew what he meant to me. Why did you do this?" The priest answered coldly, "Because if that new language spreads, young people will start thinking freely. It'll create chaos. It will destroy the kingdom. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of the disorder that will ruin the future." The king replied firmly, "Even if you try to stop it, I will build this system of writing for the people. I want to be someone who makes their dreams possible. Why should we fear a future we won't even live to see, a world we know nothing about?" But the priest wasn't moved. He fell to his knees and said, "Please execute me and end this." Soon the sky turned gray and rain began to fall, lightly at first. Danny went around the palace saying goodbye to her friends one last time before leaving. The king asked if he could walk with her to the farthest point. They walked side by side until they reached the seashore. There, Danny stepped into the same pond she had once fallen into and allowed herself to sink again just like before. Moments later, she emerged, back in her own world. She looked around and realized that only a few seconds had passed. There was still time to make it to the exam. She ran as fast as she could toward the test hall and saw her teacher waiting. The entrance exam had just started. She rushed to her seat and took the test. Later that day, she returned home and found her mother waiting. She ran into her arms, holding her tightly. Everything about Danny had changed. Her behavior, her perspective, everything had shifted after her journey. She had learned to value the people and things around her more deeply. Months passed. One day, as she walked out of school, the sky opened up and rain began to fall again. Suddenly, someone placed an umbrella over her head. She looked up and saw a face strikingly familiar. He looked exactly like the king of Joseon, but he simply smiled and said, "We met a long time ago on the bus. You dropped your umbrella," and that's where the story ends.